The sun burned low over the Texas plains, throwing long shadows over the ranch house porch. A dozen young Japanese women, eyes wide beneath worn government-issue caps, stood motionless in the gravel drive. They were prisoners of war, marched across oceans, prepared for humiliation. Instead, a cowboy in scuffed boots and a 10-gallon hat tipped his hat and gestured to a smoking grill. "Y'all like steak?" he asked, in a drawl thick with hospitality. The air was thick with the scent of charred meat, buttered corn, and something else, kindness. One woman, barely 22, looked down at her hands, the same hands that had dressed wounds under artillery fire, and watched as a paper plate was placed in them, heavy with steak, beans, and cornbread. She didn't know whether to cry or run. A prison camp was supposed to smell like bleach and blood. Not this, not home cooking, and certainly not cowboys telling jokes like they were at a family barbecue. The world she had known, of orders barked in clipped syllables, of hunger and hierarchy and fear stitched into every corner of her uniform, had ended not with a gunshot, but with a scent. Yet that moment, standing stunned with a paper plate of steak in her hands, was only the latest in a series of impossible revelations. It had all started months earlier, on an island that no longer had a name, just a position on a forgotten map and the stench of burning. The Pacific War was ending not in glory but in ash, and the women of the Imperial Auxiliaries, nurses, typists, clerks, and radio operators, were no longer part of a proud machine. They were debris in the wake of collapse. The Emperor's voice, distant and trembling over shortwave radios, had told them the unthinkable: surrender. Some had not believed it, others had wept. A few tried to take their own lives before the Americans arrived. One young woman, trained in the field hospitals of Saipan, had sharpened a sliver of metal from a broken mirror, preparing to open her wrists rather than be taken. It was what the code demanded. Bushido did not allow for mercy. Women, especially, were told that capture would mean dishonor so complete that it would stain generations. But in the end, she had frozen, trembling too much to press the edge of the blade into her skin. And then came the Americans, rifles drawn, voices shouting in a language she could not understand, but not with the cruelty she had braced for. Instead of death, there was confusion, orders, lines, water, blankets. That was how captivity began. They were herded into trucks, then holding camps near the coast. The rumor was that they would be sent to prison mines in the Philippines or forced to dig trenches in Guam, but instead they were loaded onto ships, steel-gray vessels bristling with cannons and tension. The hold was cold, damp, and smelled of rust and diesel fuel. They slept in hammocks or narrow bunks, and the sea was a thing alive, tossing their bodies like dolls. Several women became violently sick. One collapsed from dehydration. Through it all, the American guards watched with an odd silence. No mockery, no violence, only procedure. Meals were handed down, strange, rubbery food from tin trays, corn, eggs, coffee. One woman spat hers out, convinced it was poison. Another sobbed as she drank the bitter liquid because it was warm. The voyage took weeks, or perhaps it was days. Time became elastic in the dark belly of the ship. They spoke little, sharing looks more than words. Occasionally a guard would attempt a broken sentence in Japanese or offer a cigarette. The women didn't know whether to recoil or accept. Each act of civility felt like a trap. Kindness from an enemy was more dangerous than cruelty. It confused the story they'd been told. One night a nurse with a bandaged ankle sat on the floor, rocking slowly. "I don't understand," she whispered to the woman beside her. Why are we still alive? Then landfall. Not Guam, not Manila. The Statue of Liberty passed overhead like a ghost. The ship docked in a bay where the skyline glittered like something out of an American propaganda film, steel and glass untouched by war. The women disembarked silently, eyes lowered, their uniforms hanging off their shrinking frames. A few stared. One woman was called a Jap devil by a dock worker and flinched, expecting the blow that never came. Then came trains, long silver snakes slithering across a continent too vast to comprehend. When the train finally screeched to a halt in Texas, the sun was already heavy in the sky, casting everything in a golden glow. Dust clung to their boots as they stepped onto the platform, and the air smelled not of oil and steel, but of something else. Dry earth, grilled meat, leather. The landscape was impossibly wide, flat, open. The barbed wire that framed the camp seemed less like a cage and more like a question. What kind of prison smells like this? One girl whispered. Are we still at war? No one answered, because if this was war, it wasn't the one they knew. Instead of snarling guards and snarled barbed wire, they were met with paperwork and polite nods. A sergeant in a starched uniform called names from a clipboard, pausing occasionally to check the spelling, even saying please when asking the women to step forward. The women moved in silence, flinching at every movement, expecting mockery, barking, hands that would push instead of gesture. But none came. Instead, they were led through wooden gates into a compound more orderly than any barracks they'd seen in the Pacific. The gravel paths were swept clean. The buildings were painted, not crumbling. One woman caught herself muttering, "This cannot be real." She had seen men executed for less than surrender. Here she was given a number and a cot. Inside, the barracks smelled of soap and dust. Clean dust. The bunks were lined neatly, each with a folded blanket at the foot, a pillow, even a small wooden shelf beside the bed. One woman sat on the edge of hers, running her fingers over the fabric like it might vanish. Her last night in the Pacific had been spent curled on dirt beside a rusted drum, her only cover a blood-stained rag. Here there was softness. Too much softness. It terrified them. They were assigned to barracks in groups of 12. Guards explained the routines. Breakfast at sunrise, work assignments in the afternoon, lights out at 10. Everything was said in slow, deliberate English, sometimes translated by interpreters. But even when the words were foreign, the tone was unmistakable. This was not vengeance. This was system. The first morning, the women were lined up outside the mess hall. The air was thick with something strange and rich. Fat. Smoke. Bread. Some pressed handkerchiefs to their faces, thinking it was a trick, perhaps burning garbage or animal feed. But when they stepped inside, what greeted them was surreal. Trays loaded with eggs, grits, stewed beans, and thick slices of bread so white it glowed under the yellow light. One woman reached the serving line and froze. The American cook, a boy, really, with freckles and a soft drawl, held out a spoon of scrambled eggs. She didn't move, not because she was resisting, but because she couldn't believe it. He smiled, almost shyly, and said, "For you." She took the plate. Her hands shook. She had eaten nothing but saltwater rice and dry biscuits for months. Another woman behind her wept openly at the sight of butter melting on toast. She wasn't sure if it was joy or shame that made her cry. At the tables, no one spoke. They ate slowly, ritualistically, each bite an act of confusion. The bread, soft, sweet, real, was too much. A nurse who had once crushed dried insects for protein now stared at her tray like it was a sin. One woman folded her napkin carefully over the food, afraid to finish it. What if this was the last meal? What if kindness was a tactic, not a truth? Later that day, the women were shown the showers, real ones, not buckets, not saltwater tubs. They were handed thick towels and bars of soap wrapped in wax paper. The water was hot, frighteningly so. One woman cried out when it hit her back, not from pain, but from memory. For a moment she thought she was hallucinating. Her legs buckled. Another woman caught her before she fell. As the days passed, the tension didn't dissolve. It deepened. The politeness of the guards, the order of the camp, the comfort of clean sheets, it all clashed violently with the images they had carried across the ocean. They had been told the Americans were brutes, savages, men who would strip them of honor. But here a guard knocked before entering. Here meals came at regular hours. Here blankets were folded, not taken. At night the women whispered under blankets. Was this a deception? Would it change tomorrow? Could it be that they had been wrong? But that question, what if we were wrong, was harder to face than any enemy. Because if the enemy treated you better than your own command ever had, what did that say about everything you believed? They didn't yet have the words for what they were feeling, but the taste of that first bread, soft, warm, undeserved, would linger in their mouths for years. Weeks passed in the rhythm of captivity. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Yet, beneath the surface of routine, something began to shift. One morning, without warning, several names were called from a clipboard. A corporal explained in slow English that the women were to be transported for ranch duty. The guards offered no further detail. The trucks arrived before breakfast, dusty flatbeds with wood-slatted sides and benches worn smooth by time. The women climbed aboard hesitantly, unsure if they were being punished or pardoned. The journey was long, jostling over unpaved roads that kicked dust into their mouths and eyes. But what surrounded them was unlike anything they had seen before. Endless golden fields rolling beneath a cloudless sky, fences stretching like lines drawn by God Himself, and cattle moving slow and steady in the distance like ships at sea. The air was thick with the scent of manure, leather, and sunburnt grass. One woman pressed her fingers to the truck's side, her skin vibrating with the hum of the engine and disbelief. When the truck stopped, they saw them, the cowboys, real ones. Broad hats, sun-reddened necks, worn boots crusted with dust. One stood beside a horse, coiling a rope. Another tipped his hat in greeting and said something that sounded like music and gravel. The women stared, unsure if they were supposed to salute, bow, or run. But the cowboys only chuckled and waved them forward, motioning toward tools and tasks. For hours they worked side by side, brushing horses, hauling bales of hay, sweeping barns. Sweat clung to their necks. Their hands blistered, their backs ached. But no one shouted at them. No one watched them like predators. One woman dropped a pitchfork and gasped when a cowboy reached down to help her. His fingers were calloused but gentle. He smiled. She looked away, dizzy. As the sun lowered into an amber haze, the smell hit them. Charcoal, smoke, fat, fire. A pit had been dug near the edge of the field, ringed with stones, and beside it stood a man with a metal spatula and a wide grin. On the grill, sizzling in its own juices, were slabs of meat thicker than any ration they'd seen in 3 years. A table had been laid out, paper plates, corn on the cob, beans, and something golden wrapped in foil, cornbread. It looked like a feast from a world that had never gone to war. The cowboys gestured for the women to sit. Some hesitated. One looked at the barbed wire in the distance. expecting a whistle, a command, a reprimand. But none came, so they sat, slowly, awkwardly. The first bite was a sin, the second, a confession, the third, a surrender. Steak, juicy, charred, wild, melted on their tongues like butter. One woman closed her eyes. Another laughed, short, embarrassed, as if she had burped in church. The cowboys didn't flinch. One passed a jar of sweet tea down the line, and when the women drank, they gasped at the sugar. The fire crackled, someone turned on a radio, and twangy country music drifted into the dusk. The women didn't understand the lyrics, but they understood the rhythm. One cowboy leaned back on his elbows and said, "Y'all work hard. You earned this." The words were plain, but they struck like thunder. Earned, not given, not manipulated, not strategic, just offered. Steak, smiles, space. That night, on the ride back to camp, the women sat in silence. Some clutched napkins folded into pockets like relics. One licked her fingers, long after the taste was gone. In the darkness, a young nurse whispered, "I thought they would spit on us." Another replied, "They fed us." And somewhere in the space between that exchange, something old died. Not hatred, not grief, but certainty. The certainty that enemies could only be one thing. If you've made it this far in the story, we want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know. And if this piece of forgotten history has moved you, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe. The button is right below this video. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Every single click helps us keep bringing you stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you. That certainty began to crumble in the days that followed, not with grand gestures, but with paper and pencil. One afternoon, a corporal entered the barracks carrying a box. Inside were blank sheets, envelopes, and dull pencils. Through a translator, he explained the prisoners could now write home. No promises were made about delivery. Letters would be read, censored, but they could write. A few women stared at the paper as if it might catch fire. Others reached out, slowly, reverently. For so long, their voices had been silenced by distance and fear. Now, suddenly, they were being handed the means to speak. The young nurse who had once tasted steak under the Texas sky wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They gave us blankets. There was meat and kindness." Her hands trembled as she formed the characters. She paused often, unsure what to say, what she was even allowed to say. Could she tell the truth? That her captors fed her better than her commanders? That the men she was taught to fear played music while they served food? Some women folded their letters immediately, tucking in careful words with ink-smudged hands. Others sat for hours, pages still blank, caught in a war between shame and honesty. Outside, camp life took on a rhythm both strange and disarming. One morning, a guard rolled in a cart with books, some in English, some translated into Japanese. A sign read, "Library." A woman from Nagasaki touched the spine of a novel and recoiled as though it might bite. She had not read for pleasure since before the war. Another reached for a book and whispered, "Is this allowed?" The guards didn't answer. They didn't need to. The books spoke for themselves. The barracks, once echoing with silence and suspicion, began to fill with muffled sound. The turning of pages, the faint notes of swing music from a borrowed radio, the halting rhythm of women trying out English phrases. "Hello," one would say. "How are you?" Another would laugh at the mistake, then try again. Some practiced at night, whispering like schoolgirls beneath the blankets. One woman took to copying song lyrics into a notebook, humming under her breath as she worked in the laundry hut. Then came the lipstick. It appeared one afternoon in the canteen, small tubes in silver wrappers sitting beside chewing gum and cigarettes. The first woman to buy one was met with stunned silence. She stood at the mirror in the latrine, her hands shaking as she uncapped the tube. The color, bold, alive, glinted like something forbidden. She pressed it to her lips and stared at her reflection. It was the first time she had looked at herself without flinching. Others followed, quietly at first, then more boldly. Lipstick became a silent rebellion, not against America, but against the version of themselves they had been forced to become, tools, servants, ghosts in uniform. The color returned not just to their mouths, but to their voices. Laughter returned too, hesitant, then wild, sudden, like a dam breaking. One woman made a joke in broken English about a guard's enormous boots. The others howled. The guard raised an eyebrow, smiled, and tipped his hat. But joy, here, was complicated. Afterward, the laughter faded into silence, thick with guilt. One woman looked at her reflection and whispered, "I am laughing while my sister starves." Another folded away her lipstick in a sock, as though hiding a weapon. Happiness felt like betrayal. Every smile came with a shadow. Every song hummed brought memories of air raid sirens and blood. The world beyond the fence was in ruins, yet here, behind barbed wire, they were being allowed to be women again. And that was the hardest part to explain, even to themselves. They had prepared for pain, not grace. They had steeled themselves for violence, not music. They had expected to be broken, not softened. And yet the softening had begun. Quietly, relentlessly, with pencils and pages, with books and lipstick, with steak and jazz records. Not all of them welcomed it. Some resisted, some broke down, but others, many, began to wonder if survival meant more than just living, if, somehow, it also meant becoming something new, or worse, someone they never expected to be. It began with a word. One morning, the women were summoned not to the mess hall or the laundry hut, but to a long, low building with a chalkboard propped against the wall. A guard handed each of them a stub of white chalk. A sergeant with a kind face and slow voice wrote a single word on the board in bold letters: freedom. He underlined it twice and turned to face them with a smile that felt more like a question than an answer. The room was silent. The women stared. No one spoke. They didn't know what to do with the word. Some didn't know how to say it. Others didn't even know how to translate it. In Japanese, there were terms for duty, for loyalty, for submission. But this was something else. A word without weight in their world, and yet one that hung heavy in the air. The sergeant tapped the board again and repeated, "Freedom." Then he motioned for them to say it aloud. Their voices came out jagged, "Fury damu." Some giggled, others looked down at their shoes. But by the end of the hour, each woman had spoken it. Not just the word, but the idea, and that, in itself, was revolutionary. English lessons became a daily ritual. The same women who had once obeyed orders without question now stumbled through greetings and grammar. "My name is," "Where is," "I am from." The phrases were simple, yet carried the weight of identity, of location, of possibility. One woman kept a folded scrap of paper in her pocket, adding words each day like seeds in a garden. She wrote thank you, then blanket, then music. Books were handed out next: fiction, translated memoirs, American children's novels. A worn copy of Tom Sawyer passed from bunk to bunk. The women read slowly, laughing at the mischief, pausing at words they didn't know. One nurse lingered over a scene where Tom lies to avoid going to school. She stared at the sentence for minutes. The idea of lying not to escape punishment, but simply to seek freedom, was foreign and thrilling. Reading became a form of rebellion. In a world where they had been raised to obey, to sacrifice, to vanish into the machinery of war, these stories opened quiet windows. One woman read a paragraph 3 times and whispered, "He runs away because he wants to, not because he's ordered." That night, she dreamed she was on a raft, floating down a river with no destination, just stars and wind and choice. But it wasn't just English that was changing them, it was the questions that came with it. One afternoon, the teacher handed out paper and asked them to write. Anything. A memory, a dream, a wish. One woman sat frozen for nearly an hour. What did it mean to write what she wanted? Her pen hovered. Then, slowly, she wrote, "When I was a girl, I wanted to be a painter." She stared at the sentence, tears rising. She had never told anyone that before. The questions followed her back to the barracks. What if she had never joined the auxiliaries? What if her country had never gone to war? What if the men she had feared were not demons, but just men? What if we were wrong? The questions spread like smoke, unspoken but present, in the way they lingered over books, in the way they smiled at guards, in the way they no longer flinched when someone said, "Freedom." For women who had lived entire lives obeying, the very act of thinking differently was radical, dangerous. And yet, as they whispered new words into the night, as they traced their English letters with clumsy fingers, they felt something shift inside. A small opening, a breath, a sentence that began, "I am," and didn't end with a number or a rank. It ended with a name, their own, spoken aloud, heard for the first time, not as property of the empire, but as people, real, changing, alive. And yet no word, not even freedom, could silence the ghosts that crossed the ocean. Home was still there, beyond the fences, beyond the desert horizon. Japan, a name that now tasted like smoke. The war had ended, but the women's captivity had not. They were fed, clothed, sheltered, but it was a paradise that felt stolen. One morning a letter arrived, then another, then none at all. The guards handed them out with quiet efficiency, their faces neutral as the women crowded forward, hands trembling. Some envelopes were thin, some heavy, others empty, but for red stamps that read, "Return to sender." The nurse who had learned the word freedom received one. It was from her sister, written in a shaky hand. "We are alive," it said. "The city is gone. The fields are ash. We eat bark when there is no rice." The words were simple, but they struck harder than any bomb. She read them again and again until the paper grew soft from her tears. That evening she pushed away her dinner tray, the steak, the beans, the bread, unable to swallow. The food smelled like guilt. Around her others sat silent, holding letters like wounds. For months the women had lived in a strange rhythm of abundance, 3 meals a day, warm beds, lessons and laughter. Now, with each word from home, that rhythm faltered. The Americans had built them a world where comfort was routine. Their families had none. Some women refused to eat, leaving bread to harden on the table. Others began saving half their portions, tucking them away as if they could send them across the sea. One night the nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "My brother died hungry. I ate his share." The woman beside her said nothing. She simply took her hand, their fingers cold in the dark. The news that did reach them was always half-hidden, censored and filtered. The guards avoided their eyes when passing out newspapers. Still, whispers spread. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Cities turned to glass, entire neighborhoods gone. The words circled through the camp like ghosts. The women tried to imagine the places they once knew, streets lined with wooden houses, shrines, the laughter of children, all erased. One woman from Kyoto said quietly, "My home was near a river. I wonder if the water still runs." No one answered. The contradiction grew unbearable. How could they sit under a Texas sun, cheeks full, stomachs warm, while their mothers sifted ashes for roots? One afternoon, the nurse was asked by an American sergeant if she wanted seconds. She looked at the plate and felt her throat close. "No," she whispered. "No, thank you." The English words came easily, but they carried the weight of her shame. Some of the guards noticed the change. They began to speak more softly, to look away when the women cried over their letters. One even offered his rationed sugar to a woman who had lost her entire family. She took it wordlessly, pocketed it, and later buried it near the garden she tended behind the barracks. A small, secret grave for something too sweet to taste. As days passed, the divide between past and present widened. The women who once marveled at hot showers and soap now washed in silence. Their laughter grew rare, their English lessons quieter. Each kindness from their captors was now tinged with sorrow. When they looked at the guards, they no longer saw only the enemy. They saw men who would never understand what it meant to lose everything and still be alive. At night, the nurse lay awake, the sound of crickets outside her window mocking the silence of a homeland in ruin. She thought of the word freedom again and felt it fracture. Freedom, she realized, meant nothing if it came wrapped in another's suffering. Her belly was full, but her heart starved. In the mornings, she still lined up for breakfast, but the taste of food had changed. It wasn't just nourishment now, it was contradiction. It was guilt in every bite, sorrow in every swallow. And as she chewed, she could not decide what hurt more, the hunger she had known, or the fullness she did not deserve. When spring came to Texas, it did not ask permission. It arrived in the dry wind that carried the smell of earth and rain, in the call of birds that sang above the barbed wire, in the soft warmth that began to loosen the soil. One morning the women were gathered outside and handed small paper envelopes. Inside each one was a handful of seeds: tomato, corn, beans, sunflower. A translator explained that the camp command wanted them to grow something, a project for health and morale. The women looked at one another, unsure if this was a joke. Grow something? Behind fences meant to confine? One woman laughed bitterly. Another clutched her packet and stared at it like a letter from the dead. But most said nothing. They took the seeds, bowed their heads, and walked to the small plot of land behind the barracks. The soil was dry, cracked, stubborn. It took hours of work just to break through the crust. The women dug with tools that blistered their hands, turning the dirt, mixing it with whatever compost the Americans brought. Some knelt in silence, their fingers sinking into the ground as if searching for something lost. Others whispered prayers they hadn't spoken since childhood. To the guards watching from the fence, it looked like labor. But to the women, it felt like penance, or maybe resurrection. Days turned to weeks. The Texas sky stretched endlessly above them, the same blue they had once seen from the decks of troop ships, the same light that had followed them across oceans. Each morning they watered the soil with tin cans and cupped hands. Slowly, impossibly, green began to break through the brown. First thin shoots, then leaves. The first time one sprouted, a woman gasped aloud and pressed her hand to her mouth as if she had heard music. Something inside her, long dormant, stirred. It was fragile and alive, proof that something could grow in captivity. As the weeks passed, the patch of dirt transformed into color. Vines climbed the fence, tomatoes blushed under the sun, flowers swayed where once there had been only dust. The women worked quietly, but the change did not go unnoticed. Guards lingered longer by the fence. Even the sergeant who once barked orders now nodded in approval. "Good work," he said one day, his voice almost gentle. The women didn't answer. They didn't need to. The garden spoke for them. The first bloom changed everything. One morning a sunflower opened, tall, gold, radiant against the wire. The women gathered around it in silence. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one whispered, "It faces the light." Another murmured, "Even here." Some began to cry softly. For years they had been told their purpose was to serve, to fight, to obey. Now, with dirt under their fingernails and sun on their faces, they felt something new. They were not soldiers anymore. They were women again, and for the first time, that felt like strength, not weakness. Each seed had become a story, a declaration that life could bloom in a place built for control. When the wind blew through the rows of vegetables, it carried the scent of earth, sweat, and redemption. One woman began saving seeds in small paper packets, writing the English names on them in crooked letters: hope, life, peace. Another pressed a flower between the pages of her English workbook, the word freedom faintly visible beneath the petals. By summer, the garden overflowed. The women traded their produce with guards for books or soap. They began smiling again, small, quiet smiles that came from somewhere deeper than joy. Each sprout, each bloom, was a reminder that even in a world scarred by war, something still reached for the sun. One evening, as the sun sank low, the nurse sat at the edge of the garden, hands resting in her lap. The air shimmered with heat and the soft hum of insects. She looked at the flowers and thought of her mother's garden back home, long turned to ash. The thought hurt, but it also healed. Perhaps the past was not meant to be rebuilt. Perhaps it was meant to be replanted. She reached down, pressed her fingers into the soil, and whispered in halting English, "Thank you." In the shadow of fences surrounded by the ghosts of nations, something pure had taken root, not just in the ground, but in them. And for the first time they did not feel like prisoners. They felt like gardeners of their own becoming. But no garden, no matter how alive, could hold back the tide of change that swept through the camp that August. The air itself seemed to shift, the guards quieter, the males slower, the radios suddenly filled with words none of the women could understand, but could feel in their bones. Something enormous had happened. The Americans no longer whistled while they worked. The officers spoke in murmurs, and then, one afternoon, a translator stood before the assembled women, hat in hand, and said the word that made the world tilt: surrender. There was no celebration, no applause, only silence. The war that had shaped every breath of their lives was over. Not won, not survived, just ended. Some women stared at the ground. Others began to weep, softly, like the sound of rain against tin. A few clung to one another, not in joy, but in fear. The word surrender had been the one thing they were taught to avoid, to despise, to die before accepting. And now it was their homeland that had spoken it. Rumors rippled through the camp like fire in dry grass. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cities gone in a single flash. The women whispered names of relatives, friends, whole neighborhoods that might now be shadows burned into walls. The Americans said little. Even the guards, the same men who once teased and joked, walked slower, their faces drawn. At night, under the vast Texas sky, the women sat outside the barracks in silence. The stars above were the same ones that hung over Japan, but they felt impossibly far away now. No one knew what would come next. The word repatriation began to appear in briefings, but it was always spoken softly, as if fragile. Go home. But where was home now? The letters that trickled in told of rubble, famine, disease. "Our house is gone," wrote one woman's mother. "We live by the river now. We have nothing left to burn." The women folded those letters and held them like relics. They should have longed for release. Instead, many were afraid. Their captors seemed unsure how to treat them. The guards, once merely polite, became almost tender. One soldier left small gifts, apples, pencils, a folded handkerchief, on the edge of the garden fence. Another stopped calling them the Japs and began using their names, awkwardly but earnestly. Bonds had formed, quiet and unspoken. The women worked beside the guards now, mending clothes, translating small words, trading smiles that said more than shared language ever could. Some evenings, the sergeant who had taught them English would bring a radio outside. The women sat in the dirt, listening to the low hum of American music. Slow songs filled with longing. The nurse would hum along, her voice barely audible, her English halting but heartfelt. Sometimes the guards joined in, and for a moment no one was soldier or prisoner, conqueror or conquered. They were just people, breathing the same warm air beneath the same wide sky. Yet the shadow of departure grew heavier. The women began to pack their few belongings, a Bible given by a teacher, a pressed flower from the garden, a notebook filled with English words. Some tried to hide these small tokens, afraid they would be taken away upon return. Others gave them as gifts. One woman slipped her tube of lipstick to a young guard and said softly, "For your sister." He nodded, unable to speak. In the final weeks, laughter became rare again. The camp seemed suspended between worlds, no longer a prison, not yet a memory. The women walked through the rows of crops they had grown, touching the leaves as though saying goodbye to something more than plants. A few admitted what none dared to speak aloud. They did not want to leave. The thought of returning to a country buried in ashes, of facing families who might see them as tainted or changed, filled them with dread. One night, as the wind rustled through the mesquite trees, the nurse sat alone by the fence. The stars shimmered above, cold and eternal. She whispered in Japanese, "If I return, I will not be who I was." The words drifted upward, lost to the night. Around her, others were awake too, some praying, some crying, some staring toward a horizon that no longer meant home. When the guards came the next morning with new orders, no one cheered. Some stood in silence. Others looked back toward the garden, the barracks, the sky. The war was over, but in their hearts, another battle had only just begun, the one between the people they had been and the women they had become beneath the Texas sun. They left as quietly as they had arrived, bundled into ships once meant for troops, now packed with silence and belongings too small to explain what they carried. The nurse held her few possessions close, a worn English notebook, a paper packet of seeds, a single pressed flower from the garden she had coaxed to life behind the camp. As the ship pulled away from the American shore, she stood at the railing and watched the land fade into mist. No one sang, no one waved. The journey home was not a return, but an undoing. When the ship docked in Yokohama, the port looked less like a city and more like a wound. Smoke still clung to the air. Entire neighborhoods were flattened into grids of broken wood and stone. She stepped onto the dock and was struck by the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the absence of everything once familiar. No train whistles, No bicycles, no children shouting, only the crunch of shoes over rubble and the muttered orders of officers managing the returnees. She walked through the skeleton of her old town and saw shadows where homes had stood. Her mother's house was gone. In its place, a hand-scrawled sign on a makeshift board, "Family relocated. If you read this, find us by the river." She wandered for hours, feet blistering, before she found them. Her mother was alive, but smaller somehow. Bent, eyes too tired for joy. Her sister did not speak for nearly a full day. When she finally did, she asked, "What did you give them for food?" The nurse did not answer. The shame that followed was not shouted. It was whispered. The neighbors looked away. One old man muttered, "American puppet," under his breath as she passed. Children stared at her with wide eyes, not because of what she said, but because of what she wouldn't. She had survived, and for that she was marked. She tried to explain once. She said, "There was a garden." Her sister blinked. "You had flowers?" The nurse nodded. "And bread, and books." But even as the words left her mouth, she felt them harden. They sounded like betrayal. What could she say? That the enemy had taught her how to read in a new language? That they gave her dignity when her own nation had stripped it away? That she had laughed once under a Texas sky while children starved back home? In the small shack where they now lived, there was no music, no firewood, and no eggs. The nurse hung the pressed flower on a nail in the wall. Her mother saw it, touched it gently, and said, "It smells like soap." Neither of them spoke of it again. She began to dream in English, bits and fragments of the phrases she had learned. "My name is, I am from—" But when she woke, the language died in her throat. There was no room for it here. No one asked what the guards were like, or how the food tasted, or how it felt to sleep without fear. There were things that could not be shared, not because they were secret, but because they no longer fit. She worked in silence now, sweeping floors, boiling water, helping her mother patch old garments with thread that broke too easily. At night she stared at the flower. It had wilted slightly, but the shape remained, a burst of yellow against a brown wall, a reminder of a world no one believed she had touched. Some days she longed for the sound of a cowboy's voice calling out, "Y'all ready?" Other days she wished she had never stepped foot on that ranch, never eaten that steak, never let herself believe that enemies could be kind. But mostly she sat with the unspoken. Not anger, not sorrow, just the weight of memory pressed flat like the flower, delicate, silent, and never truly welcome in the place she had once called home. Years passed like rain fading into the soil, leaving no mark but the faint scent of what once was. The nurse, older now, though she never thought of herself that way, lived in Osaka, where the city had grown new bones over its ruins. The markets were alive again, the air thick with smoke and shouting, laughter and haggling. One afternoon, walking home with her basket half empty, she caught a smell that froze her mid-step. Charcoal, fat, fire, the unmistakable scent of grilled beef. The sound of it came next, the sizzle, the crackle of flame meeting flesh. For an instant the street around her dissolved, the chatter, the clatter, the smell of diesel, gone. She was back in Texas, beneath a sky so vast it had seemed to contain a mercy she could never name. She could see the cowboys laughing, the smoke curling in ribbons, the way the sunlight had turned everything gold, and she could hear the words as clearly as if they had been whispered beside her. "Y'all like steak?" Her eyes stung. She stood there, the scent of meat thick in the air, and felt her throat close. The people around her moved on, unaware. To them it was just dinner, To her it was something far more dangerous. It was memory, warm and cruel all at once. She remembered the first bite, the way it had filled her with awe and shame in equal measure. It had not been just food, it had been an undoing. The taste had forced her to confront everything she had believed about enemies and honor. It had whispered that kindness could be sharper than cruelty, that mercy could break a person in ways bullets never could. That steak had been her reckoning, a symbol of everything that had turned her world inside out. She moved toward the stall. The cook behind it was a young man, smiling as he flipped cuts of beef over glowing coals. He caught her gaze and offered a piece on a small skewer. She hesitated, then took it. The first bite was soft, smoky, tender. It melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes. For a heartbeat, she was no longer in Osaka. She was back in Texas, 20 years younger, hair tied in a scarf, surrounded by barbed wire and kindness she had never understood. When she opened her eyes again, she was crying. The young man looked startled, murmured something polite, and handed her a napkin. She wiped her face, embarrassed, and whispered, "Thank you," not in Japanese, but in English. The word slipped out before she could stop it, round and gentle, like a prayer. She walked home slowly, the taste still on her lips. That night, she sat by the window of her small apartment and opened the wooden box where she kept her few treasures: the English notebook, yellowed and fragile, the packet of seeds, unopened since Texas, and the pressed sunflower, its color faded to pale amber. She laid them out on the table, touching each one with the reverence of a ritual. They were remnants of a different kind of honor, one not forged in obedience or sacrifice, but in the strange, humbling grace of being seen. She realized then that she had never truly left that camp. A part of her still lived in that place of contradictions, a prisoner in a land of freedom, an enemy fed with compassion. The steak, the soap, the books, the garden, they had all been lessons written in a language beyond words. As the night deepened, she whispered the only truth she had carried through the years. "They did not destroy me," she said softly. "They made me remember what it means to be human." Outside, the city hummed with life, and somewhere in the distance, the faint scent of grilled beef drifted through the streets. She closed her eyes and smiled, not with regret, but with recognition. The war had taken everything from her, but that moment, that taste, had given something back. It was not victory. It was not forgiveness. It was understanding. And that, she thought, was enough.